This is a study vlog on John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and today I'm going to be talking about the character of Crooks. To understand the character of Crooks, we really need to dig into the historical context of the novel. What was life like for a black person like Crooks in 1930s America? We have to go back to the history of America, really, and go back to how the black community were treated historically in that nation. Back in the 1860s, America had a civil war. But did you know that that war was actually about slavery? The North wanted to abolish slavery, the South wanted to keep it. And the reason is the economy of the South was really driven by slavery, people making plantations and using slave labour to get extremely wealthy with cotton, sugar, products like this. The American Civil War was fought and the North won, and at that point slavery was legally abolished in the United States of America. And the people in the South were told they had to free all of their slaves and let them walk away. So you can imagine that a lot of southern farmers were extremely unhappy about this. And so what began is a resistance to this idea of the black community being given equal rights and not being enslaved anymore. So you may have heard of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865, which is just off the back of the Civil War, and was very much a terrorist group of white men who dressed up in white garments with hats to disguise themselves. And they would carry out violent acts to kind of ensure their superiority in their communities. Now, the Ku Klux Klan obviously was an illegal group, although unfortunately lots of people in power were part of the Ku Klux Klan. But there were also other ways that people in the American South would keep black people as oppressed. And so what often happened was laws would be passed, such as the Jim Crow laws, which were basically a way to keep black people down, even though they had been given legally the right to be equal. So you may have heard the word segregation. Segregation was policies of keeping black people separate from white people, so giving them different schools, different churches, different facilities, different areas to sit in the park. And this is something that happened in America from 1870 right up to the 1960s. So you may have heard of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. That really happened in the 1960s when people like Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white person, and finally black people began to get more widespread equality in America. But as the Black Lives Matter movement shows, equality for black people in America is still very much a live issue, and the way they are treated by certain institutions such as the police continues to be a very thorny topic. So let's get back to Crooks. Crooks is living in California, so he's not in the deep south of America, but as a black man he still has to be treated very separately to the other workers on the ranch. We found out in chapter 2, when Candy was first telling George and Lenny about the people on the ranch, that Crooks is the stable buck. And whenever the boss gets mad, he gives the stable buck hell. And Candy's explanation for this is that it's because of Crooks's race. He uses the N-word, and we obviously find this a really offensive term. Unfortunately, back in the 1930s, this word was very commonly in use, particularly for white people to refer to a black person, and it definitely had a very derogatory, insulting tone to it. Candy also tells us that Crooks is a nice fella, he reads a lot and has books in his room, which gives a real sense that Crooks is someone who is intelligent, he wants to be educated in the way that he can, and he keeps himself to himself. He doesn't live in the bunkhouse like all the other guys, and that is because of his race. So we can see in Crooks evidence of segregation for black people being kept separate, And we're going to start to see the impact that's had on Crooks's life when we meet him properly in chapter 4. Now, the other thing that's important to note about Crooks is that he has a physical disability. Like Candy, he's been affected by his work, and he's got a problem with his back, which means that he is known to the men as a cripple. Now, he's a more permanent fixture on the ranch than the others, so he has his own space to live in, and he's been able to accumulate a lot more possessions. So this is what's interesting about Crooks, is that he's got that unique status, really. He's living on the ranch much more longer term than the others, and he's managed to build up personal items of worth. It tells us that Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people kept theirs. Now, it's interesting that Crooks does that, because that is a kind of knee-jerk reaction to being lonely. You know, when you keep people at arm's length and you won't let them get close to you. Now, we see Crooks in detail in chapter 4 because most of the men have gone into town. Lenny appears in the doorway, and Crooks shows his defensiveness by kind of asking him quite angrily what he's doing there. He says, "This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Gradually, he realises that Lenny's a little bit slow in understanding and isn't really a threat. And so he begins to invite Lenny in to sit down, and Lenny tells him all about the dream. They're going to get a ranch, they're going to get all these animals. Crooks thinks he's pretty crazy. Crooks understands why it is that George hangs around with Lenny, even though Lenny doesn't really understand things. Crooks understands that it's the chronic state of loneliness that most of the men experience. He says, "A guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go blabbing. George knows what he's about, just talks and you don't understand nothing. You couldn't remember it anyway. I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if he don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking, or they're setting still, not talking. It don't make no difference. No difference. It's just being with another guy, that's all." So Crooks understands the way that George is dependent on Lenny as a friend, as a presence, as a friendly face in a world that's very hostile and a world that's very lonely. But it's interesting that Crooks uses his kind of understanding to initially kind of scare Lenny by saying, you know, what if George doesn't come back? What are you going to do then? At which point Lenny doesn't really understand and gets quite aggressive. Crooks backs off by this point. But it's interesting that Crooks's defensiveness means he feels he has to strike first. Crooks also is sceptical about whether they're ever going to make the dream a reality, because let's face it, it's a dream he's seen many times before. He says, "I seen hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches with their bindles on their back and that same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of them. They come and they quit and go on. Every damn one of them's got a little piece of land in his head, and never one of them gets it." Crooks sees the dream as something that is just in their head. It's something that everyone loves to think about because it gives them a grain of hope to get through the day. But nobody ever actually does it. Crooks is surprised to learn from Candy that they actually have the money in the bank ready to actually make the dream a reality, and he starts to want to join in. He said, "If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand." But then Curly's wife comes onto the scene, and instantly the tentative friendship that is gradually opening up here is threatened immediately with her presence. Of course, she's looking for Curly, predictably, and her face was heavily made up, and she looks at all of them and gives quite a cruel but accurate assessment of the fact that they're all the weak ones who've left and not gone to the brothel in the town. She said, "You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you." But Crooks politely says, "Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." And then Curly's wife responds, "Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while?" She doesn't want to go back to the house because she knows she'll be there on her own. This reveals that she wasn't really looking for Curly at all. She was looking for conversation. Candy gets a little bit defensive. He says, "You got a husband. You got no call fooling around with other guys causing trouble." The girl flared up. "Sure, I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he?" Then she asks what happens to Curly's hand, and she sees the bruises on Lenny's face. She begins to put two and two together. She says to Lenny, "Where'd you get them bruises on your face?" And Lenny looked to Candy for help and said, he got his hand caught in a machine. Curly's wife laughed. "Okay, machine, I'll talk to you later. I like machines." Candy broke in. "You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm gonna tell George what you says. George won't have you messing with Lenny." It doesn't take much for Curly's wife to kind of find a little bit of leverage here. If she realises that Lenny has beaten up Curly, she has a way in of trying to let her stay for some conversation. But Crooks gets a bit frustrated with her and says, "You got no rights coming in a coloured man's room. I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more." And then, of course, Curly's wife plays her trump card. "You know what I can do to you if you open your trap." And then, of course, she's referring to getting him, as she later says, strung up on a tree. Now, to give you some background on that, lynch mobs were really common in the 1930s. If a white woman said anything to accuse a black man, chances were a mob of people would come and publicly hang the black person without a fair trial on a tree publicly to shame him in front of everyone. So Crooks knows that this is a real danger for him and quickly shrinks back into himself. Candy says, "We'd tell about you framing Crooks." And then she says, "Nobody listened to you." It's a cruel threat, and suddenly Crooks's fellowship with the men is torn down. Crooks recedes back into his shell. Curly's wife stomps off, and he says to Candy on his way out, "Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Just forget it. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that." Obviously, he does want it, and that's why it's so sad that we finish chapter 4 with Crooks alone again in his room, rubbing his back with a little bit of liniment cream. And there's that poignancy of this guy being treated in this way because of his race, with no real prospects and left alone at the end of this chapter. We saw very briefly a glimpse of what life could be like for Crooks if he joined the dream, if they bought their own farm, and he finally had a place where he could be safe. But the fact remains that his status in society is precarious because of his race. And that's going to take a long time for that to shift in the public consciousness.
Hit subscribe if you'd like to follow my vlog for more updates on teaching, reading and studying.